Hey, yeah, I know we're talking about some sour subjects right now, but while we're here, I figured I'd talk about something sweet, and that is my co-owned my co-owned candy company that I have, Sour Boys. We got candy for you. Every single week on Friday, we launch a new flavor of candy, and they're delicious. I only have empty bags on my, because I eat them all. And I know you guys have been loving them, so I really want to give you a little discount code, okay? Specifically for this video, and only for the first 100 of you. We're gonna make one. Let's see. It will be, something to describe you. What will it be? Stunning. The code, stunning. And I'm gonna give you 20% off for the first 100 people that go. So go grab some Sour Boys. I really appreciate your support on all that. We have so much fun making the candy and like being in the factory and doing all that stuff. We have such a great team behind us, and I cannot thank you enough for all the support on that. So enjoy some candy, and I do these kinds of codes almost every single video, so always make sure to tune in. But without further ado, let's get back to the video. All right, so most of you probably know what a vampire is, thanks to Dracula and Twilight and whatnot. But do you know where they originated from? And do you know the very dark following that has emerged because of them? Well, today we're gonna talk about just that. So for those of you, for some reason, who don't know what a vampire is, basically, the vampire is a mythical creature of darkness, blood, and immortality that has captured the human imagination for centuries. From ancient folklore to contemporary films and literature, the vampire's story is rich, multifaceted, and deeply tied to human history, fear, and belief. But where did the legend of the vampire originate? And how did it evolve into the figures that we recognize today? I think we need to start from the beginning, which was in early Mesopotamia and Mediterranean civilizations. So the earliest known references to vampire-like beings come from the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. And while these creatures were not necessarily called vampires, they shared many traits associated with later vampire legends. First up, we have Lilitu and Lamashtu in Mesopotamia. And the Sumerians and Babylonians had myths surrounding Lilitu, a demon who preyed on newborns and pregnant women by draining their life force. And Lamashtu, another demon, was similarly feared for her nocturnal attacks on infants and mothers, leaving her victims weakened and sickened, evoking early ideas of creatures living off others' vitality, aka their blood. Next we have Umpase and Lamaya, I'm probably saying those wrong, from ancient Greece. And in ancient Greece, the Umpase were shape-shifting demons who feasted on blood and seduced men. Slay. While Lamia was cursed to drink the blood of children. That's not as good. And these early Mediterranean myths laid the groundwork of the idea of female, seductive, and bloodthirsty entities, a common theme among vampire mythology, aka what basically bred the sexy vampires you see in today's media. And then we have the early Chinese and Indian beliefs. The Vatala was an undead spirit that inhabited corpses, preying on humans by possessing their bodies. Though not a vampire in the modern sense, the Vatala's association with death, possession, and malevolence echoes vampire traits. And the Jiangshi in China, which also I probably pronouncing that wrong and I apologize, or otherwise called the hopping vampire, was a reanimated corpse that drained the life essence of its victims, otherwise known as qi. And like later European vampires, the Jiangshi was often depicted as a creature that preyed on the living to sustain its unnatural existence. Which brings us to the European vampire, otherwise known as the Middle Ages to early modern period. So the modern conception of the vampire as a reanimated corpse that drinks blood of the living owes much to the folklore of Eastern Europe, particularly the Slavic regions. The Strigoi in Romania was an undead being that returned from the grave to feed on the blood of the living. So like just that classic like out of the grave, bust through, go, kind of like a zombie, almost like a zombie. And the Strigoi was thought to be created through like a violent death or an improper burial, and could be dispatched only through specific rituals, such as decapitation, or driving a stake through the heart, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, that wooden stake through the vampire's heart. It's the only way to kill a vampire. Turns out, it's not, allegedly. And then we have Nosferatu in Transylvania, later made famous by Bram Stoker's Dracula. Nosferatu was a plague carrier and was believed to spread death and disease through the nocturnal feeding. And these vampires could be repelled by garlic, You heard that one. Holy water and or a crucifix. Elements that became staples in later Western vampire myths. So let's talk a little bit about the role of religion and superstition in vampire beliefs. And a lot of that stemmed from the Black Death. The Black Death being the bubonic plague, which decimated Europe in the 14th century, and it gave rise to the fear of death and the undead. Mass graves, unburied bodies, and the rapid spread of disease led people to attribute these tragedies to supernatural causes. Naturally. And the reports of revenants, corpses that returned to the dead to terrorize the living, were common during the plague years. Which, like, yeah, that makes sense, you know? You got nothing else going on. There's, like, snake oil doctors and witches and stuff. Why wouldn't you believe in some dude coming up from the dead and drinking your blood and giving you the plague at night? I mean, that's what would fuel me, honestly. And then we obviously have the Christianity influence as well. Because in Christian Europe, vampires were often associated with hearsay, sin, and the devil. The idea of the vampire as a creature damned for eternity and trapped between life and death resonated a lot with religious fears of eternal damnation. So the use of holy symbols like crosses, holy waters, and the consecrated ground to ward off vampires reflects the deep ties between vampire folklore and Christian belief. And then we jump ahead to the vampire panic of the 18th century. In the 18th century, vampire hysteria gripped Eastern Europe, particularly in regions such as Hungary, Poland, and Serbia. Exhumations of suspected vampires became common, and grisly rituals to prevent their return, including decapitation and driving stakes through the heart, were participated widely. That's crazy. That's like you're just digging your mom up because you think she might have been a vampire and just re-killing her somehow. That's like, I guess there was not a lot to do back then either. So like, again, why not, I guess. And the reports of vampire attacks circulated in newspapers across Europe, further fueling the panic. And this is also when vampirism would transition from folklore to literature in the 18th and 19th century, a shift that would lay the groundwork for the modern vampire archetype. Books such as The Vampire, written in 1819, written by John Polidori, was one of the first works of vampire fiction in the English language. And Polidori's vampire, Lord Ruthven, was a sophisticated aristocratic figure who preyed on high society, contrasting with the crude peasant vampires of folklore. And this portrayal would influence the refined and seductive image of vampires in later literature, like Twilight. I'm making fun of it, but I literally love Twilight. Okay? Team Edward all the way. And this next one, Carmilla, was written in 1872 and is fire. Alright? It was written by Sheridan Le Fanu's, and Carmilla is introduced as the first significant female vampire to Western literature. Carmilla, a beautiful and seductive vampire, preys on young women, intertwining themes of eroticism, death, and the supernatural. Basically, everything I know you like. I know you do. I'm looking at you. You're gonna read this book after I know it. And Carmilla would become an important precursor to later vampire literature, particularly with its exploration of lesbianism and seduction. Again, slay. And then we obviously have Bram Stoker's Dracula, written in 1897. No discussion of vampires is ever complete without Bram Stoker's Dracula, which solidified many of the traits associated with vampires today. Count Dracula, a Transylvanian nobleman turned vampire, embodies both the fear and fascination with immortality, bloodlust, and sexuality. Dracula not only cemented the vampire's place in pop culture, but also created a template for countless vampire stories to come. So let's move into the modern vampire, the 20th century to present vampire. The 20th century saw that the vampire myth evolved dramatically as it moved into film, television, and later a global pop culture consciousness. Nosferatu in 1922 was a silent German film made by F.W. Murnau, don't know if I said that right, and remains to be one of the most iconic portrayals of a vampire. Count Orlok, the central character, is a far more monstrous version of Dracula. He's badass, basically, capturing the terror and grotesque nature of the vampire myth. Highly recommend watching it. And Universal's Dracula, made in 1931, portrayed Count Dracula. I'm sure most people know who that is. And this became the definitive image of what a vampire is for decades to come. With the classic slick-backed hair, thick Transylvania accent. Count on Sesame Street, shout out, and evening attire. And Lugosi's Dracula was both menacing and mesmerizing, creating an indelible cultural image. And as the 20th century progressed, vampires became more nuanced figures in the media, with the publication of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire in 1976. In the film adaptation in 1994, vampires were no longer just monsters, but tragic, tortured beings grappling with their immortality and moral dilemmas. I don't know if I hate this movie or love it. I think I love it. I think it just dragged on a bit. I think I love it. I rewatched it a few years ago. I gotta revisit it. But it's got Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise in it. You can't really go wrong with that. And I think little Kirsten Dunst, is that her name? It's pretty good though. And in the 21st century, we saw a new wave of vampire narratives that blended horror, romance, and social commentary. Yes, I'm talking about Twilight. I know all you want to hear about is Twilight, and I don't really need to explain it, but Twilight is Stephenie Meyer's book, published in 2005, and the series reimagined vampires as brooding, immortal teenagers. And the romance between a human girl and a vampire with a moralized conflict over bloodlust brought the vampire myth into the mainstream for younger audience, sparking a global pop culture phenomenon. Phenomenon doesn't even begin to explain what this did to culture, what it did to me. I think Twilight shaped me into the person I am today, I think. Did it shape you? If not, that's probably for the best. I still watch the movie back and I feel things that I probably shouldn't feel, but I do. So, and then we have shows like True Blood in 2008 and 2014, and The Vampire Diaries from 2009 to 2017. And these television shows explored the themes of desire, identity, and power, with vampires as metaphors for societal issues like civil rights, sexuality, and alienation. And these genres just continued to evolve, not just focusing on the horror of vampirism, but on the complexity of relationships, communities, and politics in the supernatural world, which is important. We also have movies like Blade, Underworld, 30 Days of Night, which I cannot recommend enough. I think it's so fun and awesome. It's basically this horror film based off a graphic novel, and it's set in Alaska, where vampires descend on a small town during a month of complete darkness. And the film focuses on survival horror and depicts vampires as ruthless, monstrous predators. And those are my favorite kind, besides Twilight, of course. But give it a watch if you like horror. And then you got shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I never really got into, but I hear it's good. And What We Do in the Shadows, cannot recommend that enough either. It is so awesome and funny. If you don't know What We Do in the Shadows, there's a show and there's a movie. So good. I don't even really want to explain it, but it's like comedy meets vampires. Yeah, that's basically it. But it's like ancient vampires in modern day Staten Island, and it's so funny. And now that we covered the basic history of vampires, we're going to talk about the grim outcome of the fascination with vampires, and that is vampire killers, because we couldn't do a deep dive without talking about killings, could we? Probably not. Well, probably could, but didn't want to. But vampire criminals, or vampire killers, or psychopathic vampires are people who commit murders and drink blood of their victims. And in order for a crime to be considered a vampire crime, which I didn't know existed, but now I do, the drinking of blood or the desire to drink blood must be a major motive. So the three reasons why we know a vampire crime has been committed are hematomania, which is deriving the pleasure from drinking blood. Gross. Renfield syndrome, the belief that a person is actually a vampire, which turns out there's a lot, and I was one of them. And when I was a kid, wasn't killing people, wasn't doing any of that nonsense. It was more just running around the forest, just screaming, and if you know, you know. If you watch my TikToks from 4 years ago, that was funny for you, nobody else. Or the involvement in satanic type rituals. Not me, that's just one of the three reasons if you committed a vampire crime. Anyway, but the vampire subculture as a whole does not associate themselves with these individuals, stating that they are not real vampires, and that the subculture does not promote violence or crime in any form. And we'll get into this subculture in a bit. I know this deep dive is quite literally all over the place. It's kind of an ADHD deep dive, I apologize. I wrote it and it's a bit all over the place. We're going to talk about crimes, and then we're going to talk about the subculture. And we're going to kind of work from oldest to newest as best I can. And we're going to start with the infamous Vlad the Impaler. So Vlad III, commonly known as Vlad the Impaler, was active and alive from 1431 to 1476 or 77, we're not quite sure. But he is one of the most iconic historical figures tied to vampirism, largely because of his influence on Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. And while Vlad himself was never believed to have actually engaged in vampirism, his brutal and blood-soaked reign as a 15th century Prince of Wallachia, hope I'm saying that right, which is now modern-day Romania, left an indelible mark on history, blending with regional folklore to inspire the archetype vampire figures. So Vlad was born in 1431 in Transylvania, in the city of Sighisoara, sorry if I said that wrong, which was part of a kingdom of Hungary. And his father, Vlad II Dracul, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which sounds awesome. Because if there's anything I love more than vampires, it's dragons, alright? Let me know if you want a deep dive on dragons, because I'll f***ing do it. But the Order of Dragons was founded to protect Christendom from the Ottoman Empire, whatever that means. And the name Dracul means dragon in Romanian, or devil in more modern interpretations. I was just gonna say, oh, I'm gonna name my firstborn that. Probably not. I like dragon, not so much the devil. And Vlad III, otherwise known as Vlad the Impaler, earned the name Draculea, which means son of the dragon. That's cool. Maybe my firstborn will be named. No, probably I shouldn't name it after an infamous serial killer. Probably shouldn't do that. Never mind. And this is the origin of the name Dracula, which Stoker later borrowed from his vampiric count. And Vlad's life was shaped by the constant warfare between Christian Europe and the expanding Ottoman Empire. And at some point during these wars in 1442, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent as political hostages to the Ottoman court to secure their father's loyalty to the Sultan. And this period of captivity profoundly influenced Vlad's later life, fostering a deep hatred for the Ottomans and the desire for vengeance against those who wronged his family. Guy holds a grudge, basically. And Vlad is most famous for his 3 reigns as the Prince of Wallachia, particularly in his second reign, which ranged from 1456 to 1462, when he earned his notorious reputation. And the infamous method of punishment employed by employed by Vlad was, you guessed it, impalement. Victims would be seated on long, sharpened wooden stakes, which were driven through their bodies, often taking hours for them to die, even sometimes days. And this practice became so widespread that Vlad earned the nickname Vlad the Impaler. And according to historical accounts, he killed tens of thousands of people during his reign, including Ottoman prisoners, boyar rebels, and common criminals. His use of impalement served both a deterrent to his enemies and a form of psychological warfare. No shit. And there's a place called the Forest of the Impaled, which is one of the most chilling stories from Vlad's reign, which in 1462, during a confrontation with the Ottoman Sultan, Vlad ordered the impalement of 20,000 Ottoman soldiers and civilians. And this would naturally cause his enemies to flee and leave the scene because they're like, "F that shit, I'm out." But anyway, though Vlad the Impaler was never a vampire in the literal sense, his blood-soaked legacy became intertwined with vampire mythology, particularly through Bram Stoker's Dracula. The connection between the historical Vlad and the fictional Count Dracula is complex and somewhat symbolic. And this brings us to our next vampire serial killer, and that is the famous, or infamous, Elizabeth Bathory, otherwise known as the Blood Countess. So Countess Elizabeth Bathory was alive from 1560 to 1614, in one of history's most infamous figures associated with vampirism. Known as the Blood Countess, she was a Hungarian noblewoman who allegedly tortured and killed hundreds of young women, primarily from the lower classes, over the span of decades. She basically just made it her hobby. And her reputation as a vampire figure stems from macabre legends that claim that she bathed in the blood of her victims to preserve her youth and beauty, though the story has been heavily debated by historians. But Elizabeth Bathory was born to a very powerful aristocratic family in Hungary, with relatives that held very significant political influence. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, was the king of Poland, and her family's wealth and prestige shielded her from scrutiny for many years, hence why she got away with killing hundreds of women. And when she got married at the age of 15, gross, in 1575, her her husband would often be away at war, leaving Elizabeth in control of the vast estates and overseeing the day-to-day affairs of the household, which included the lives of the peasants and servants who worked for her family. And the legend of Elizabeth's crimes and cruelty began with rumors of her cruelty towards her servants, particularly the young girls. And she reportedly used her status to escape any sort of repercussion for her actions. Over time, however, the stories of her brutality grew darker and more widespread. According to witnesses and later accounts, Bathory lured young women to her castle, often under the pretense of offering them work or schooling, only to subject them to horrific and eventually murder. And the common accusations included, but were not limited to, severe beatings and like being whipped, burned, or cut, freezing or starvation. She would love using needles or scissors. What? Scissors. Do with that information what you will. And she was a big fan of bloodletting and ritualistic elements. And this is where the vampire myth kind of comes in, because witnesses later claimed that Elizabeth drained the blood from her victims, and in more sensational accounts, bathed in the blood of virgins specifically, believing that that was going to rejuvenate properties in her skin. She's basically doing what Kim Kardashian is doing now with the blood facials or whatever. I don't know. It's weird. That's not the same. It's not the same. I get uncomfortable talking about this stuff sometimes, and I gotta say other stuff. So I know it was a long time ago, but I hope this bitch is burning in hell, is what I'm trying to say. And despite the overwhelming evidence against Elizabeth, she was never actually formally tried. And some historians suggest that that was because of her noble status, and a public trial could have caused embarrassment to her powerful family. But instead, she was just imprisoned eventually in a small room within her castle. She was basically grounded, where she would remain until her death in 1614. At least there were some repercussions. Which brings us to our next killer, Kallmekris. Sounds like a nice name, isn't it? It's not. Otherwise known as the Vampire of Cinkota, or Kinkota? I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. But Kallmekris was a Hungarian serial killer active in the early 20th century, and is one of the more chilling real-life figures whose grisly crimes have contributed to the vampire mythos. His methodical and ritualistic killings, especially his apparent obsession with blood, have earned him the place in the annals of criminal history, and his story has taken on an almost mythological quality due to the eerie details and the mystery surrounding his fate. Kallmekris was born in 1877 in Hungary. A lot of vampires coming out of Hungary. And he would live most of his life in a small town, Cinkota. Again, sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Near Budapest, and he led an otherwise unremarkable existence, working as a tinsmith and cultivating a respectable reputation in the local community. He was described as intelligent, well-spoken, and unassuming, a trusted member of the town who concealed his darker side from the public view. So in 1912, Kiss's wife would run away with another man, Tisk, or probably justified since this guy's a f***ing monster. And the betrayal is probably the thing that triggered his violent tendencies, because soon after this, he began placing personal ads in a local newspaper, seeking companionship and promising marriages to lonely women. And these ads primarily targeted women who were widowed or unmarried, and often in a vulnerable financial situation. However, Kiss's true intentions were far more sinister than finding a new spouse. So over several years, Kallmekris lured numerous women to his home in Kinkota, I'm just gonna call it Kinkota, where he promised romance, financial stability, and marriage. But once they were isolated, he would strangle them, drain their blood, and preserve their bodies in large metal drums. That escalated very fast, I'm sorry. And it is believed that Kiss murdered up to 24 women, though some estimates suggest that it is far more. And the bodies would be discovered in 1916, during World War I, when Kiss had already been conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army. His house was being requisitioned by the military for war efforts, and workers would find several metal drums on his property, and they would naturally open them and see the preserved bodies of the women that he killed. And the corpses would be preserved in alcohol, which actually preserved them remarkably well, and each bore distinct puncture wounds in their neck, leading investigators to suspect that Kiss had drained their blood. And while there is no conclusive evidence that Kiss actually drank the blood of his victims, the fact that he drained it at all was particularly alarming, because this evoked traditional vampire lore, which was very prevalent at the time. And the deliberate act of bloodletting and then preserving the bodies kind of added to the ritualistic element to his crimes, which led some to speculate about vampiric motives. And that brings us to more recent vampire killers. Yay! Not yay. These people are sick. And the first guy is Fritz Harman, otherwise known as the Vampire of Hanover. And Fritz Harman was a German serial killer active in the early 20th century and is one of the most infamous examples of criminal engaging in vampirism. Between 1918 and 1924, Harman was responsible for the murders of at least 24 young men and boys in Hanover. And Harman's modus operandi, otherwise known as MO, involved luring the boys to his apartment where he would end their lives by biting through their throats in a vampiric manner. Ooh, it's just bad. And the grotesque act of this gave him the nickname the Vampire of Hanover. And after killing his victims, he would often get rid of them by, if you know what I mean. Though there was no confirmed evidence that he actually drank their blood, I'm gonna safely assume he probably did. And then we have the other POS called John George Hay, otherwise known as the Acid Bath Murderer. And John was an English serial killer active in the 1940s, best known for dissolving the bodies of his victims in sulfuric acid. However, John also exhibited vampiric-like tendencies, as he reportedly drank the blood of some of his victims. Hay was specifically fascinated with the idea of immortality and believed by drinking the blood he could attain eternal life. Newsflash, he's dead. Guess it didn't work. But this is a theme commonly found in vampiric folklore. And John's murders were involved with wealthy people whom he lured with the promises of business deals and financial opportunities. And after killing them, he would extract their blood and dispose of their bodies in the acid, leaving zero forensic evidence behind. And his fascination with blood and immortality strongly suggests that he had a delusional component that was likely rooted in narcissism and psychopathy. And then we have Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. And he was active in the 1970s, and he is quite literally one of the most extreme and horrifying examples of criminal participating in vampirism, as if the other ones weren't bad enough. And Chase was severely mentally ill, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and he believed that he did need to drink blood to prevent his heart from shrinking, and this is a delusion that fueled his violent killing spree. Chase would murder 6 people in the span of 1 month in Sacramento, California. After killing his victims, he would drink their blood in whatever way he felt best. And in some cases, he would also consume some of their organs, aka cannibalism. I don't know if cannibalism is if you drink blood, is that cannibalism? I feel like you have to eat it. Oh God, why are you listening to this? You're sick. It's okay. We all are. But basically, his crimes were motivated by his intense psychosis and belief that consuming blood would cure his imagined physical ailments. And then there's quite literally so many more cases. We'd be here forever. There's Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov, who killed at least 52 women and children between the years 1978 and 1990, who would also drink his victims' blood. And then we have Tsutomu Miyazaki, the Otaku killer, who was also known as the Little Girl Murderer. What the f***? Who was a Japanese serial killer that targeted young girls in the late 1980s, who would also drink his victims' blood, and also ate part of them as well. I don't want to talk about it. And then we have Marcelo Costa de Andrade, who was a Brazilian serial killer who was active in the 1990s and murdered 14 young boys. And again, drank the blood of his victims because he thought it would grant him power or strength or something. It's so dumb, and I hope all these people are burning in hell. And then there's Rod Farrell, otherwise known as the Vampire Clan leader. He was the leader of a self-styled vampire clan and committed a gruesome double murder in 1996 in Florida. Farrell, who was 16 at the time, believed himself to be a 500-year-old vampire named Visago, and Farrell and his followers engaged in ritualistic behavior that involved bloodletting and drinking blood as part of their vampire identity. And the list goes on and on and on and on. There's so many cases. It is actually insane. I could talk forever about it. But let's get into kind of more modern day in the, 2000s kind of time with modern day vampires and the subculture. The less violent, but still consensually violent subculture of vampirism. And like I said before, there are a lot of shows that revolve around vampirism, but not just scripted shows, but also shows that that people walk about the earth thinking that they're a vampire, for real. And not just like the crazy people who are killing people, but people that just consensually drink other people's blood it's consensual. It's a lot, but it's very prevalent in New Orleans. There is quite literally a vampire subculture that live in New Orleans, and this subculture is composed of individuals who identify in various ways with vampirism, whether through symbolic practices, fashion, or even blood consumption. Ugh. and they're kind of split up into groups. There are some that practice psychic vampirism, which these individuals believe that they can drain and absorb life energy from others. And this energy transfer is consensual and considered part of the spiritual and metaphysical practice. And then there's sanguinarians, sorry if I'm saying that wrong. And these individuals who consume small amounts of blood, typically from consenting donors, as part of their identity. And in New Orleans, specifically, there are strict protocols and safety measures for bloodletting within the vampire community. How do you get into this community? Who do you talk to? Do you just like walk down the street at like 3 o'clock at night and just say, I'm a vampire, and they all just, that would be sick. I'd join, wouldn't drink the blood, but that'd be cool. There's even a famous vampire-themed night in New Orleans called the Endless Night Vampire Ball that's held annually around Halloween. And this lavish event draws thousands of attendees from around the world, all dressed in gothic vampiric attire. And it takes place at various venues throughout the French Quarter, and is a celebration of vampire culture, complete rituals, dancing, and performances. Sounds kind of fun, I'm not gonna lie. And there was even a show called The Life of a Modern Day Vampire, otherwise known as The Vampire Chronicles, that featured many different vampires that live in New Orleans, one of which is Balthazar. And Balthazar is interesting to say the least. Basically, he introduces himself as a 54-year-old Seguin vampire who has been drinking blood since the age of 11. And he recalls his first experience of tasting blood after an altercation with his uncle, which triggered his vampire instincts and awakened his need for blood.
I could actually taste blood.
And Balthazar explains how his body shows physical signs when he hasn't consumed blood for a while. He experiences pale skin, dull eyes, feels physically unwell, and the need for blood is essential for his well-being. And it's funny how he humorously is just like kind of dismisses the traditional myths of vampires, like how garlic doesn't actually harm them. He actually enjoys it on pizza, and holy water just makes him wet kind of thing. It was kind of funny. And he also confirms that he does not sleep in a coffin, but he has a king-size bed, which is kind of fire. And he also discusses how vampires nowadays don't have supernatural abilities necessarily. That's convenient. But instead they use sanitary methods to consume blood from willing donors. And I couldn't watch it. It was weird. But he describes how he uses clean blades and alcohol swabs to ensure the process is safe for both him and the donor. Who is donating? Who is it? I don't know. You freaks out there, man. What the freak? And a psychologist even commented on the phenomenon in the show, describing how individuals like Balthazar may be drawn into vampiric behaviors due to the ritualistic and dramatic nature of the practice. It allows them to feel unique, which I think is just our friggin' culture nowadays. Everybody needs to be different, or like have something wrong with them conveniently, or like be a vampire or something. Like, not all people, obviously, but I think it's just like, that is just, and I think it is from very much being online. It's just like, okay, how can I be different? How can I stand out? And it's just like, you don't need to do all these things. You don't need to drink blood, Balthazar. My God, just eat your garlic pizza and sleep in your king bed. And there's also a individual named Don Henry. I found him. This is why this all stemmed from. He's a person that came across a vampire, that came across my feed somewhere, and I saw a clip and I was like, what?
Where we're doing a special Tyra show vampire investigation. So let's meet a man known as the Vampire King, Don. Come on out.
But apparently, this has been a thing since 2004. He had a show called Mad House on the Sci-Fi Channel, where he was one of the central figures, known as an alt of the group's individual with alternative lifestyles. And in the show, Henry represents the vampire subculture, which gained him the nickname the Vampire. And his calm demeanor, distinctive appearance, and pale skin, long black hair, and dark attire, along with his mystical persona, attracted attention from within the alternative community and from mainstream viewers, like myself. And Don Henry is specifically a sanguinarian vampire, which we talked about before, meaning he claims to have a need to consume small amounts of blood, human blood, to maintain his physical and emotional well-being. And according to Henry, that is not driven by fantasy or myth, nay, but by what he describes as an actual physiological necessity. In various interviews, Henry has emphasized that his practice is consensual, involving donors who willingly provide blood in a safe and controlled environment. At least there's that. And beyond blood consumption, Henry also identifies as an energy vampire, or psychic vampire, a common belief in the vampire subculture. And energy vampires are said to feed off the life force or life energy, called prana or chi, of others, to maintain their own energy levels. And this belief, while spiritual, is often metaphorical and represents a form of emotional and psychological exchange. And they do this in the show, and it's interesting, to say the least. Don Henry also lives a nocturnal lifestyle for the most part. He says that his senses are more heightened at night. Mine are. I'm blind as a bat at night. I gotta wear glasses if I drive at night, otherwise I am veering off a bridge. And he also says that he has extreme physical discomfort being in the sun too long. Same. I'm just very pale, and I burn. I think that's normal. It's probably normal. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, by the way. Like, do you? I don't give a shit. As long as you're not hurting anybody and everything's consensual, I don't care. But like I said, Mad House in 2004 was a reality competition series where contestants lived with 5 individuals from alternate lifestyles, known as the Alts, alongside Don Henry, who represents the vampire community. There were a witch, a modern primitive, a Wiccan, and a voodoo priest. That party would be lit. And the show's format included the alts challenging contestants to tests of endurance and understanding their respective lifestyles.
I'm not the last vampire. I'm an MC done. Make it say, yo, vampire, and do the walk. And if you think you can't outbite me, your boy, I bet I never met another vampire who can do that yet.
And Henry's role as a vampire brought significant attention from the vampire subculture, with audience intrigued by his calm, mysterious persona and the rituals he claimed to practice. And this basically made him like a spokesperson for the vampire community. He's like the president, or at least was. He was even on like Tyra Banks and a couple other interview shows, which was so interesting. And now people like thirst over him on TikTok. That's how I saw who he was. So basically he was like the vampire before like Twilight really was like a crazy, massive pop culture phenomenon. But yeah, it's just interesting, you know. I think vampires specifically have like taken over our culture in so many ways, in a lot of negative ways, obviously, but also it's just interesting. It's interesting, I think, how so many of us just want to be different or like have superpowers, and it's just like superheroes. I think for most people it falls into that category. It's like, wow, that'd be really cool to like turn into a bat or like be sexy and read people's minds and not be able to sleep and go to an island and, I don't know, have a vampire sleep with you or whatever. It's like the plot of New Moon, or I can't remember which one. But yeah, I just find it interesting. I love these like mythological kind of / real things that people have taken very seriously. Again, if you enjoyed the video, little history lesson, let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to deep dive into more stuff like this. Dragons, ? But until next time, I will see your beautiful face in the next video. All right, bye.